to Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Hello.
And Darren.
Hello.
So the 2010s aren't quite over, but the release of Pitchfork's highly anticipated end of the decade list has everybody reflecting back on the music of the last 10 years and compiling rankings of their own. So we just couldn't wait any longer to join in on the fun. We're going to count down and I'm sure argue about our personal top 10 albums of the 2010s. But we also want to save plenty of time to talk about releases that made an impact without necessarily being the best, discuss the decade's biggest musical trends, and of course, bitch about Pitchfork's list. So I want to jump right into it. And, you know, I was remembering when we did our top 5 albums of 2009 and barely fit it in an hour and a half. So now we're going to try to do top 10 albums of an entire decade. Let's just, you know, we'll try to keep it short. We'll try to keep it moving. But Dan, what is your number 10 album of the 2010s?
Yeah, my number 10, I went with Daughters, You Won't Get What You Want from 2018. It's a record I talked about on the podcast here. I only really got into it like a couple months ago, but I'm just absolutely loving it, and I haven't stopped listening to it since I found out about it. It's for anyone who doesn't know, it's like this weird kind of like really heavy like Swans kind of thing, but with like a guy who sounds like Danzig singing. It's they used to be like some sort of like hardcore band. It's wild stuff. I'm just loving it.
I've never listened to that. I know that it's like kind of Fantano core. Is that right?
He gave it a 10, yeah.
Really? Wow. Okay, I
yeah.
didn't know that. So 2018. Wow. So 2018, already making it into your list. Darren, I don't suppose Daughters is on your list, so what's your number 10?
Number 10 for me is from 2011, and it's Take Care by Drake.
Okay, all right. Very interesting. Why did you pick this one?
Well, you know, this was actually one of the albums that kind of reviewing the decade brought me back to. It brought me back to a time when Drake was actually good. Okay. He's had a little trouble this decade, I would say. But this album was like really, really awesome. Like when it came out, and like just putting it on for another spin, I was like, oh my God, just kind of like remembering how great the album is. Almost every song is like a banger in one way or another. I won't spend too much time, but
yeah, I mean, yeah, fascinating pick. I actually didn't even revisit it because I always liked it, but it never like really, really clicked with me. I think because it's so long, but it is an interesting. You tell me if you agree. It's like the early 2010s. I think were kind of fascinating because you saw indie and like mainstream pop and R&B and hip hop kind of crossing into each other, bleeding into each other a lot. And there's like a lot of, you know, weirdly indie vibes on this. You have like the Jamie XX doing some productions. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. And, you know, speaking of kind of like guests and stuff, like there's a lot of guests on this record. I mean, you've got like The Weeknd, Kendrick Lamar, Nicki Minaj, Rick Ross, like everyone who's like getting either like they were hot at the time or they were about to get really hot, you know, like ending up on this record. I mean, Andre 3000 is also on it, which
that's a memorable verse actually.
Yeah, so it's a good one.
All right, well, Drake, I'm guessing is not on Dan's list. Big Drake hater over there.
Yep.
Oh, but I haven't done my number 10. Sheesh. Swans, The Seer. I don't suppose this is on a little higher on anybody's list?
It's a bit higher on mine, but
okay,
it is there.
So, you know, weirdly, as I was re-listening to albums these past 2 weeks, I was surprised to find that I preferred The Seer to Be Kind, and To Be Kind didn't make my list. You know, reflecting on it now, I think that To Be Kind is a lot more accessible, and it's a lot more popular for that reason. And I think it helped Swans click for me. But now I just love The Seer so much more for some reason. It's like, you know, it's hard work to listen to, I would say, but like good post-rock or something, it always pays off. And I think what's interesting, you know, maybe you don't want to spoil too many of your thoughts, Dan, if it's a ways away, but, you know, it's like when it kicks off, it's really quite groovy and fun. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And even what's amazing to me is like even the slowest parts have this burning intensity that is, I think, rare in the history of recorded music. I think it's just a fascinating document. But okay, so maybe we'll come back to that one. Your number 9, Dan, is?
My number 9, Godspeed You Black Emperor, Alleluia, Don't Bend, Ascend from 2012. I think this is just like the perfect mix of the old, pre breakup, whatever sound, with their newer contemporary sound. We've still got those huge buildups, the whole crescendo core thing, but then they're really starting to intersperse with those like just straight ass drone tracks, which some people bitch about. I love them. And I mean, the first track, Melodic, I think it's pronounced. That's one of the best Godspeed songs ever. This is just, this was their comeback record, and it just blew me away. I still love it to this day.
I'll jump ahead. That's my number 7, actually, and it's. Sometimes when you're trying to think of a list like this, and we're going to talk more about this, but it's like, man, how do you don't associate Godspeed with like the 2010s necessarily, like they made their mark in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it feels weird, right, to put them on a list of the 2010s, like it's thing it's supposed to represent this decade, and yet I found myself just deciding, Godspeed is one of the best bands ever, and this, in my opinion, is their best album. You might not agree with that, but you would at least call it one of their best, And so it's like, why fuck around? Like, I'm just going to put it on there. And I think what makes it so fascinating for me is that it's their most like punk album. You know what I mean? There are like downstrummed, power chords and stuff. The way the first track builds up, and then we actually like move into a similar kind of vibe at the end of the second, big track there. We drift like Worried Fire. And it's got like this lo-fi kind of, I always think of it like Godspeed's basement tapes or something. And indeed, when you're trying to like place it in this decade, how does it fit? It actually doesn't. And it like proudly doesn't fit in the decade at all. It sounds like this lost band that we hadn't heard in so long, like this weird, it almost sounds like some strange bootleg from some like basement show that they played, or you know what I mean? It's got that vibe. I think that's what makes it so exciting for me. And yeah, listening to it now, I mean, it just holds up, and you just can't help but like, you almost like break a sweat how with like the crescendos there. Okay, so your number 9, Darren, is?
Number 9 for me is from 2016, and it's Puberty 2 by Mitski.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
So, obviously this decade, and we'll probably get into this, indie rock in general, not a great deal of very memorable albums, I would say. I think Mitski comes out of this decade, being one of the few that I think come out on top, right? And, Pitchfork obviously named like Be the Cowboy, her 2018 record, like record of the year, and that's a great record. But for me, it was kind of always Puberty 2 being the one that really stood out to me.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because Puberty 2 ended up much higher on their 2010s list than Be the Cowboy.
Right, which I think is telling, because the records are fairly different. I think she moves in a bit more of a pop, dance almost direction with the Be the Cowboy, whereas this one is really, her with a guitar and a band, like very much in that like indie rock mold of what we're familiar with. And I think her best songs are on here. I think her best writing is on here. It's a great album, and it's one that I've like pretty much consistently listened to.
That's very interesting, because to me it's like one of the perfect examples of what I think you were talking about earlier, which is like the little indie rock gem that kind of is peppered through this decade that I don't really ever revisit, but I have sort of fond memories of. So it's interesting that it was, I was shocked actually to see it so high on Pitchfork's list, because I never thought of it like a top 30 kind of an album. But, it's interesting that it transcended that kind of gem quality for you. My number 9, Father John Misty, I Love You, Honey Bear. Did that make anybody else's list?
No. Not at all.
So this album is like, this is something I want to return to, but it's like, you're constantly struggling. I mentioned it earlier with this, like, do you pick albums that are like important or something that kind of sum up the decade or a certain period, or do you pick albums that are just good no matter what, whatever that means? To me, this has both. This is like kind of firing on both of those important cylinders, where it's sort of like, in the mold of this kind of 70s singer-songwriter thing, but it's got sort of interesting production where there'll be, it's got like these lush strings and sometimes surprising, like even mariachi things and like weird synths and stuff. There's something like a unique modernized take on the singer-songwriter of the 70s vibe. But the lyrics, man, are just too fucking real. Like, I feel like, I was revisiting, this might come up on somebody else's list maybe, but like Arcade Fire's The Suburbs, right? Which is like this definitive album that came out in 2010. Didn't make my list, but it's like, about this kind of it really captured this like alienating feeling of that era, you know, like being young, growing up in the suburbs, and this aimlessness and stuff. I feel like this album, I Love You Honey Bear, it's kind of like catching up with the narrator of the suburbs now that he's like in his mid to late 20s and still doesn't know what the fuck to do with his life. You know, it's like, I just feel like it captures, I don't know, like the 20-something millennial bitterness, anxiety. You know, there's like a lot of love songs here, but they're always like undercut with this humor. Like he can't even be in a sincere relationship because he's just hyper aware of how fucked up everything is or whatever. I mean, I don't know. It's just, it like speaks to me to the point where it's almost uncomfortable, but I sort of love it for that. Number 8, Dan.
Yeah, number 8, I got Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds with Skeleton Tree from 2016.
Okay.
You know, this is the first record after Nick Cave's son died, his 15-year-old son, and a lot of the songs were like written before that happened, but like obviously they sort of take on this other meaning like with that tragedy, and it's just like a crushing record. You know, from like the first notes of Jesus Alone, which is like just this real like droney like Sun almost kind of guitar, it just like grips you right from then. This is the kind of record like if I start this record, you got to finish it. You know, there's no stopping.
See, that's my thing. Is like I love this album, and I did revisit it, and I think it's wonderful. But it's like, you know, I always have trouble with those albums that are like, you gotta be in the right mind frame. You gotta sit down, start to finish. It makes it hard for me to think back and be like, oh yeah, I listened that often. You know, that's really stuck with me. You know what I mean?
I get you, but I listen to this record a lot, and I have like since 2016. This is like one of the records that like sort of stays on my phone at all times. This whole trilogy, you know, Push the Sky Away, Skeleton Tree, and then the new one, Ghost Teen. Which with Ghost Teen, like this sort of like a problem with doing these lists, like. When the decade's not actually over, and it's so close, you know, like because Ghost Teen is something that, you know, if you ask me in 5 years, it'd probably be in the top 10 of this list. But just this whole trilogy is just like so fantastic, and I think Skeleton Tree is right now the shining star in it for me.
All right, what's your number 8, Darren?
Number 8 for me is also from 2016. And it's The Life of Pablo by Kanye West.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. I'm actually very curious to see how many Kanye albums are, you know, in our discussion. This actually didn't make my list, though, but why did it make yours?
Yeah, I mean, this was one that I actually left off some of my early drafts of the list. In fact, you mentioned like the suburbs. It was on here at one point. It was taken off. There were a few others that were kind of in the running. But I just felt like I couldn't deny The Life of Pablo. Kind of revisiting it. It was really interesting actually listening to this in some other Kanye records and other favorites and sort of realizing, I think back when the album came out, I was like, this is like maybe Kanye's best, like right up there with Dark Fantasy, all this kind of stuff. And pretty much for that whole year, I was listening to it a ton, you know, Kanye fever, whatever you want to call it. But, you know, upon like returning to it, I kind of like noticed, I think, some more like flaws, some things I just didn't care for, like moments where I was like ready to just skip to the next track, because there's like some bangers on here, but there are some low points on the album. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Some low lights, if you will.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I sort of settled on the idea that this could be like my favorite Kanye album, but I have to admit that it's not the best Kanye album. Because it you know how fond I am of like white album style albums. I talk about this pretty much every episode, but like there's lowlights, there's highlights, you know, there's stuff to dig around through, there's little gems you find, you'll just one day like, I never even realized how good this little song is, you know. But listening to it this week, you know, I did find that there's something about that like inconsistency that makes it more of an album, and I never do this, but more of an album that I kind of pick and choose. Like I listen to this album often, but I almost never go from start to finish.
Yep,
you know,
same.
I will say this is on my list, and it's number 6, so we're getting close to it. So I'll go ahead and say it. But you know, like you said, like this is sort of like because I hate doing it too, but it is like a little bit of a you can skip around kind of album.
Yeah.
And one thing I'll do Semi frequently is start like in the the bonus tracks kind of start like after Silver Surfer.
Right.
I always sort of wish that was just an EP on its own, and so sometimes I will listen to it like that, like starting with 30 Hours through to St. Pablo. So I feel this one is like sort of disjointed, but I mean, it's still like a great record. I think it 100% deserves to be in the top 10 of the decade. I mean, just think of like how much impact it's had. Like people were wearing Pablo shirts for forever. Like just in the culture, it's so important. The rollout is sort of the first taste of the now
first taste
standard Kanye rollout. But it was like sort of fun because it was the first time we like experienced that. Like, I mean, I remember like we were in Chicago when this record released, which was fun, and like not knowing when it's going to come out, and it was on SNL, and we had gone to see Godspeed in concert when we got out, like the
That's right.
record was coming out, like and stuff. It was really fun, like rollout. And I mean, just the record itself, you just cannot deny, like it's a great fucking record.
Yeah, I feel just the same. There's just something a little weird how it almost like tries to be a self-contained record, all through the track Wolves. You know what I mean? Or including like Frank's track, and it's like he made that record or something and then was just like, you know what, dude, I'm adding all the other shit that I did on this. And like that's what elevates it to classic status, because I don't think like Wolves or, even like FML, I don't, that's another, not worth talking about, but like The Weeknd was so important this decade. And now I cannot stand him. Like anytime I listen
really
back,
overplayed. Yeah.
What the hell? I can't stand it. It's so annoying. But anyway, so, it's that like that, I'm going to try to make an album so it hangs together, one of the greatest opening tracks in history with Ultra Light Beam, but then being like, you know what, fuck it. I'm a genius and I have a lot of ideas that don't fit and I'm going to put them in there anyway.
Sounds about right.
So my number 8 is My Bloody Valentine with MBV.
Oh, wow.
Okay. That's like, it was on my a list of records that might make the list, but I didn't make it.
So, yeah, I absolutely adored this when it came out and haven't listened to it a lot since. And I actually noticed, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but this idea of like memory hold albums that were like so hyped at the time and got completely forgotten. And I saw a lot of people mentioning this as a good example. Now, I think that is literally only because it's not available on streaming.
I was going to say, I was going to ask that.
That probably has a lot to do with it.
That's why I don't listen to it that much.
Yeah, I rarely listen to it, honestly, since it came out. I mean, I adored it when it came out. I listened to it nonstop. And then I just found myself being like, you know what? I haven't listened to that in a long time. I'm gonna put it on. And it's like from the second She Found Now starts, I just feel like I melt into my chair. It's like, I don't even think there's a need to compare it to Loveless or anything. It's obviously not as good as Loveless, okay? But and it's doing something a little different, I think, in the sense that it's like, you know how it works, like 3 tracks in this sort of like mellowed out style, 3 tracks in like sort of a different, more minimal style, and then 3 tracks with like a more aggressive drum and bass thing. It's an interesting layout, but it just, the whole thing, you're just like in awe at. I mean, this is a master. Again with the Godspeed thing, it's like, how do I put a My Bloody Valentine album in the top albums of the 2010s? But God damn, I mean, this record just hits me. And that's another thing that I found myself doing. I want to talk about our approaches to this list in a minute, but it's like, a lot of these records I loved. If I put it on, does it still amaze me? And this certainly does. Okay, we are on to our number 7s. What is yours, Dan?
Yeah, my number 7, David Bowie, Black Star from 2016.
Okay.
I mean, basically, Bowie, he has released nothing but lackluster at best to bad at worst records since Scary Monsters in 1980. So you do the math, how long that is. And then he shocks the world by like releasing this art rock masterpiece. It's like this combination of free jazz, krautrock, and like God knows what else. And then fucking dies 2 days later. Like,
I know.
Like,
stunning.
Like what the fuck? Like what a. I mean, I'm sure he didn't know he was going to die 2 days later exactly.
But the lyrics really make you.
But it makes you think. Yeah, exactly.
I remember listening to it when it first came out and being like, is he okay? You know, like,
yeah,
really...
yeah, the same. And then just like, I mean, what a cap on a, like, even though he hadn't released like basically any records that were good since 1980, anything before 1980 is like basically fantastic. So, you know, what a cap on like one of the greatest artists of all time, you know. I love this record to this day, and you know, it's another one of those ones that just like rarely has left my phone since 2016, you know.
Yeah, it didn't make my list. It is a great album, but let me ask you, and this is just sort of a philosophical question. I mean, if he didn't die, if he was still alive, would this be the kind of album that would make your list?
Yeah, I think so, because in those 2 days before he died, like I listened to this as soon as it came out, because even though he hadn't released a good record, I still checked them all out, you know, just hoping, you know, you finally get it. But in those 2 days, I was fucking loving this record, so much so that when he did die, I was like, oh, fuck, now, you know, like, because I was still listening to it at work and stuff, and I didn't want people to be like, oh, fuck, you know, Bowie died, here goes Dan.
Yeah,
you know, I was like self-conscious about it. Yeah, that's stupid, but I literally was like a little self-conscious about it. But no, I think I've talked about it on the podcast. I love a good story and stuff, and I think that like really does add to like the legend of a record and the enjoyability of it. So I mean, that does help it. But you know, maybe it'd be number 8 or 9 if he didn't die.
Right, okay.
You know.
Yeah, well, longtime Metaphoric listeners will remember when Darren famously disrespected this album by just leaving it off his top 10.
Well, because I looked at it as an album, I did not take into consideration the death of an icon like you two did. Obviously, it was a good record. Just wasn't a top 10 for that year.
Wow. So I don't suppose you changed your tune in the years since.
No, definitely not.
Okay. Your number 7, Darren.
Number 7 for me. It's from 2012. It's Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar.
Okay.
Didn't make my list, surprisingly. I was really surprised.
Yeah, didn't make mine either. I thought about it, but it didn't make it.
So of Kendrick's albums that came out in the last decade, this is the one that always... I felt like blew my mind. It just blew me away the first time I heard it. And coming back to it, I was sort of like reminded of just like, oh my God, this album is so great, you know? And because I had spent so much time listening like to Pimp a Butterfly and Damn, because we covered Damn on the previous podcast and everything. But this record was just so much fun. You know, it just seemed like a guy just like literally coming out of nowhere. It seemed like to me, with just an incredible like, you know, rapping ability, just incredible like lyrics, and just so much fun. Like even all like there's a lot of like little skits and stuff in between a lot of these songs. Like they were still like, they're fun to listen to. They're not very long. Like I can just go with the flow. I don't feel like distracted by them too much. Like just overall, I mean, it's not a perfect record obviously, but like to me it's like it's pretty damn important for Kendrick's career, and personally it's his best to me.
I agree, it's his best. I fully expected it to make my list, but then when I revisited it, I found myself lacking patience for the skits, and I also found myself kind of surprised by, you know, the last 2 tracks, Real and Compton, are kind of like the weakest parts of the album, and it's just unfortunate that it ends on that note. You know, it's got this great arc, which is sort of like him growing up or something, and it's like by the time you get to Compton, it's got this really big, grand, like, you know, Dr. Dre style production that's like, I've arrived, I'm here, you know? And I so much more enjoy the early tracks that kind of evoke when he's like a little, you know, dickhead kid, like fucking around and, you know, being like an arrogant asshole, you know, that those are still stunning. But, you know, I found like the whole arc not really working for me like it used to. Why didn't it make your list, Dan?
So, sort of a similar thing, you know, like I don't have as much patience with the skits anymore. And then, you know, it's like a record, like when I think about it, like I'm like, yeah, I love that record. That record's great. But then when I listen to it, it's like hard to listen to the whole thing. Like I never really want to like invest that much time, especially with the skit. There's just like there's too much like fluff around it. I do think it's probably his best record. But yeah, it's just like it'd probably be in my top 20. But it's just not enough to crack the 10. You know, it just hasn't held up for me.
Yeah. A weird example I thought of, like when I got to Swimming Pools, you know, it was kind of like, God damn, this sounds old. This sounds like
it does sound
the biggest hit of 2012. Yeah. I don't know what that is. we can talk about that later, why things age and why things don't. My number 7, I already talked about it, Godspeed You Black Emperors, Alleluia Don't Bend Descend, from 2012. I keep forgetting to say the year, but Darren's doing a good job with that. What is your number 6, Dan?
I already talked about it. Kanye West, The Life of Pablo from 2016.
All right. What is your number 6, Darren?
Another one from 2016 for me. It's Teens of Denial by Car Seat Headrest.
Okay, interesting. Damn, you're on that indie rock.
Yeah, they needed some representation because I knew you two assholes were not going to. I remember, I still remember the podcast where we talked about this, Gabe, and we spent so much time just sort of talking about the fact of how somebody becomes inspired by a rock band, right? Like when you discover Nirvana for the first time or whatever, you become almost obsessed with them. You want to learn more about what they're doing behind the scenes, outside the studio, or how the writing process, all that sorts of stuff. And I remember specifically obsessing over Car Seat Headrest just because I love the record. I felt immediately that same sort of inspiration that I had felt sort of more so in my youth, when you're discovering a lot of music for the first time. So I felt it was a real return to that, obviously really great songwriting, the sort of idea of just any idea is a good idea and just throwing it all out there and just making this grand album full of that. We all know about his career and his songwriting and everything. It just felt like everything kind of sort of clicked and came together on this record.
Yeah, it is kind of an awesome record. I feel like it's almost a better version of what that Mitski album represents to me, which is the indie gem, but just a really, really good one. Weirdly, I'm just realizing now I don't listen to it that much because I'm so attached to the track that it sort of interpolates the Cars, just what I needed.
Yeah.
And he had to change it at the last second, and so I have downloaded, the original version, but you can't stream that. And so I just never put it on. And I just wanted to mention that because fuck Rick Ocasek, I'm glad he's dead. Okay, I'm just kidding. I'm a little harsh, but damn, I was really fucking annoyed by that because I thought it was so cool.
Well, what's really annoying is that I use my Google Play Music to sort of sync my iTunes library. And for some reason, I guess when you're streaming that record, it changed the song, because I had always had the original download as well,
right.
And when I stream it from on my phone, it plays the later one or whatever, the changed one. It's really annoying. That. Yeah.
Okay, my number 6 is Sufjan Stevens' "The Age of Odds" from 2010. Is that on your list, Aaron?
It's not, but it was one that I definitely returned to. But it didn't make my list though.
I know it's not on Dan's list, but I think it's
definitely.
I think it's just incredible, and it's a great example of 2010, this early period. Like I said, when everything was just sort of crossing and mixing, it just felt like this wild frontier for some reason, where you could kind of do everything. And Sufjan, this folksy dude, who I never actually before this I didn't like that much. I thought Illinois was cool, but not the best thing ever. And then I heard this, and he's thrown on, just every idea that he could possibly have, where it's it's got this folksy vibe, but then it's got this heavily orchestrated, extremely dense Mahler-esque, use of strings and stuff, mixed with electronics, drum machines, choirs. It's just everything. And but at the end of the day, it's the songs are, I think, just incredible. Stuff like "I Walked" is just, it just moves me in so much. Vesuvius, and then you've got "Impossible Soul," at the end, which is 25-minute song that just never quits. And so it's got the fun and excitement that to me sounds really fun from the perspective of 2019. So it's sort of damn, that was really a really fun time, when this kind of crazy experimentation was going on. And yet at the end of the day, it just comes down to these absolutely incredible compositions. We are into our top 5s now. So Dan, what's your number 5?
Yeah, number 5. We talked about it a little bit already, so I'll be brief. Swans, The Seer from 2012. I mean, just a monster of a record. You know, this is the second record from the like reformed Swans, and I love the first one. My father got me up a Rope to the Sky, but this is the one where they gel as a band. They become like this new sound. You know, that previous record still sounds a bit like a mix of old Swans and Angels of Light and stuff, but they become like this new band, and it's like one of the best bands of all time. Like, I saw Swans for the first time live during the Seer tour, and it just blew my goddamn mind. They're probably the best live band I've ever seen. I flew to New York to see their final 3 shows, like as this band, and this record is just fantastic. I mean, the ending. It's maybe the best ending of a record ever in The Apostate, when the drummer Phil is just like going goddamn nuts on that bass drum thing. There's this whole thing, like such a monster, so fantastic. I love it.
It's interesting. It was interesting listening this past week because I've been listening to the new Swans album, Leaving Meaning, at the same time, sort of, and you know, this one just makes that sound very, very weak. You know, different band now, and you know what I mean. Like I quite like it, but it just sounds, you know, completely flaccid compared to this.
I mean, we privately had talked a little bit, and I said I was a little disappointed with this new record, and yeah, that's the thing. Like this sounds like a giant like piece of art, music, whatever, whereas this new one, it's sort of back in that like, you know, pre-Seer reform thing, where it's like they're still working it out, still, you know, it's still great. I love this new record. I love Father Will Guide Me Up a Rope to the Sky, but it's on a different plane of existence than the trilogy.
And, you know, like I said, I like there's sort of a softer vibe to this new one, but it's like the softest parts on the Seer are still just intense. I don't even know how to explain it. All right, Darren, your number 5.
Number 5 for me comes from 2013. It's Modern Vampires of the City by Vampire Weekend.
Interesting.
Yes. Just, you know, really, really great, like, indie pop album. You know, I love Vampire Weekend. There's no, you know, I haven't really been secretive about that at all. And this record has been one that I've listened to like nearly nonstop. Like it's always kind of somewhere in the rotation, even if it's not the entire record. It's just like a couple of the songs, like Don't Lie, Everlasting Arms, Yeah Hey, things like that. It was a real big part of like when my son was born in 2014, which is like a year after the record came out. It's just kind of something we always like put on a lot, you know, when he was going to sleep or whatever. I don't know why in particular, but it's just like a really great record. Just a lot of fun listening to it.
That is sort of a fun thing that I guess, you know, like you're not supposed to mention, but it's like each of these albums, as I was revisiting them, it's like they all bring me right back to that, like the moment when I sort of fell in love with the record. And I think it's just impossible to, you know, avoid letting that sort of color your assessment a little bit. But yeah, I mean, a really great record, but it's not one that I've revisited much. For some reason, I actually found myself, I did revisit it, and I revisited their other 2010 album, Contra, you know, and just found Contra surprisingly holding up really well for me. Better than this one, but we've talked a little bit about, we might end up doing a Vampire Weekend episode, so we'll have more to say for sure. My number 5, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble for this, Kanye West Yeezus.
It's a little low. I mean, it's on my list.
It's number 4 for me, so I'm good with this.
Right.
Yeah,
I don't have to feel so bad. Yeah, you know, when I made my first draft, it was like number 2, I'll say, and it just sort of slipped down. And I think, you know, it still has, again, I talked about like when you put on a record, does it still sort of blow you away? And this one does, except that there are like a couple songs that don't really blow me away. You know, I think of like Guilt Trip and Send It Up, you know, kind of buried in the back half there. And when you have like a 10-track album like this, you know, that can really sort of hurt it. It's not that they're not like bad at all, and I still think this is a 10 out of 10 album, but it's like it almost feels like the first half, and then you got like, you know, sort of Through Blood on the Leaves basically, and then comes back with Bound 2 is like, I'm just in awe at the record because it is so aggressive. It is so like punk, you know, it is so, the lyrics, it's amazing to realize that like this came out like 7 years ago, and the lyrics still shock me. Like when I hear him talking about putting his fist in somebody like a civil rights sign, I'm like, holy fucking shit. In fact, it might even be more shocking now, with the current climate where you can really get in trouble for saying something like this. It's just like he is lashing out at just fucking everything. Like, it's not even like, it's just like he's lashing out like anything that contains him, even like his own race. He's gonna like he's like, I'm not black, I'm Kanye. I'm just gonna totally desecrate fucking anything, apartheid or like Martin Luther King or just, you know what I mean, Darren?
Yeah, absolutely. The way he raps in New Slaves, like at the opening, like is just so aggressive and like it almost like frightens you, right? Like it like this is a person who like is scary. Like it is scaring me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And coming back to this record, it's actually this record that put The Life of Pablo so low, actually off my list at one point, but then like ended up lower on the list because it was so much better to me. Like coming back to it, like it was just the energy, the aggression, like the rawness. Like I guess, at the time we were thinking, man, it does feel kind of rushed compared to like dark fantasy, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But after hearing, Pablo and then everything that has come out subsequently, Yeezus sounds like a complete idea. Like, like something that was really well thought out.
Very cohesive.
Yes. And it's actually become a lot better for that in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the record's coming up for me on the list. I guess I'll save the number for whatever. But you talked about like memories with records and stuff. This one, those SNL performances, those are the greatest SNL performances of all time. I've watched them more than I've ever watched any performance of anything, I'm sure. And just like I can remember like where I was and like that New Slaves performance, just being like, what the fuck, this is gonna be the best record, and it, just like instantly like blew me away. And then I remember the record leaked. I was going to like the beach or something, and it like leaked. So I'm scrambling trying to get it downloaded before I'm leaving. Get it on the phone and just listening to it. It's rather short, and I live like an hour 15 or so from the beach, and just like probably listening to it 3 or 4 times like on the way, and just being like, this is amazing. It was one of those records that like, sometimes you hear like, at least for me anyways, like sometimes I'll hear a record and the first time I hear it, I'm like, that is going to be a classic in my, book.
Right.
And this is one of those. The Seer was another one. I just absolutely love this record.
Yeah. I went to a music festival, like hosted by the XX actually, a couple days after this dropped, and the DJ was like spinning tracks from it, and everybody was completely losing their shit. And I just really felt like this is a moment, like this Kanye has, this is like a world beater type of moment. And again, what's most important to me is that it still sounds every bit like the world beater it was when it first came out.
Exactly.
Okay, so your number 4, Dan.
My number 4, Young Thug, Barter 6 from 2015. This record was the first time I had ever heard Young Thug or anything, and at first I was like, it's good, okay, but then I kept like something kept drawing me back to it. I kept listening to it, and then I just like absolutely fell in love with it. It is just like, it's an insane record. Like he's like some sort of alien, he sometimes you can barely understand what he's saying. When you can understand him, you're like, I don't know what that means. I know the words, but I don't know what that sentence is. And he's just saying this like fucking out there stuff. The production is like top notch throughout the whole album. It's very cohesive. It like seems like a album, which is something that trap artists are not well regarded for doing. This is just, I think, like a special record, and Young Thug's a star now and stuff, and I think Barter 6 is what put him on that path. But I still think this record is underrated. This should be, when people talk, hip hop classics of the 2010s, maybe even all time. I think this record deserves mention.
Yeah, it's interesting that like within a month or two, I remember this dropped and Future's DS2 dropped.
Yeah.
And they were the two albums that just made me like stand up and take notice. Like, wow, trap is gonna be like one of the defining phenomena of this decade, you know. And yeah, I think Bar 6 didn't make my list, but I do consider it kind of like a 10 out of 10 record. I think it would be like in my top 20, 25. But I found myself feeling like, yes, this will be the defining document of trap music, and yet, am I the only one who feels like trap is getting a little fucking boring, a little stale now in 2019?
Nowadays, yeah. I mean, even, you know, I'm a huge Gucci Mane fan, and even the last this new one, Woptober 2, was okay, but even the last like handful have not been that great. I mean, honestly, the only one that's been turning out great records still, and he's had a few duds, but is Young Thug.
Yeah. You know, it's again, just like a weird thing how things can sort of start to age poorly, but it's like trap saturated the market. Okay, your number 4, Darren.
Yep, my number 4 was Yeezus, which we just talked about. Yep.
All right, my number 4 is James Blake's self-titled from 2011. Not on anybody else's list, I don't suppose.
Negative.
Not on mine.
Well, you know, I think that it's been one of my favorite albums the entire decade. I think it's really stunning because it's, you know, we talked about that Burial album, Untrue, recently.
Yeah.
And it sort of builds off of that vibe, which became, I think, really, really important to the decade. But it's basically like deconstructed pop music, but so deconstructed to the point where it's like, you know, it's sometimes just a single like vocal melody looping and being messed with, or like just the lowest bass and just like the most minimal drums in what feels like the most vast empty space or something like that. It sort of makes it creates like sort of a loneliness feeling that, you know, we also talked about when it comes to Untrue, like this isolation for some reason, but also this really fascinating, I don't know, just idea of like how we can go somewhere from pop music, you know, how we can elevate pop into something just completely bold and original. So yeah, and I found myself really feeling like, again, sort of melting into my chair when I'm listening to some of these vocal melodies. I don't think James Blake has had such a great decade since, in my opinion, especially his last album I really, really don't like, but this stands up for me.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because I actually enjoyed this record when it came out. I remember listening to it quite a bit, but I have not listened to like basically anything else since then.
Yeah, I listen to all of them and I find them, you know, he's like moved, it's weird, he's moved more and more into what I would consider something like traditional pop. Actually, I liked, you know, I've liked some of his albums, but they're much more normal than this one. And it's kind of weird that he came out of the gate with just a complete deconstruction of what pop music had to be, and then simplified things as he went along. Let's see, number 3. We're on for you, Dan.
Yeah, number 3, we basically already talked about it. Kanye West, Yeezus, from 2013.
All right, your number 3, Darren.
Number 3 for me comes from 2016, and it's Blonde by Frank Ocean.
That's my number 3 as well.
Excellent. You know, I wanted to mention this. If there's any, you know, fans of Metaphoric out there, they may know that I actually left Blonde off of my top 10 list back in 2017. I don't remember that. Yes, but I do think, and somebody can fact check this, obviously, I believe I said something along the lines of like, I need more time with this record. Like, I just want to. I feel I could kind of see this record being really incredible to me, but I just needed more time with it at whenever that was. But obviously, over time, it has grown on me. It has been an album that I've come back to time and time again. You know, I had Channel Orange kind of up there in my early list, and I ended up dropping it off because I just felt like Blonde sort of transcended what Channel Orange was sort of like introducing. You know, when you hear a song like Solo, right, and just the thought process of just having like a vocal over like an organ, you know what I mean, without adding anything else to it, is such a bold decision. You know what I mean? Like to just not do anything else is incredible. And knowing the history of how this album was constructed, the amount of time that was obviously put into it, like I always find myself wondering, what that process must have been like to land at this, like, what I would deem a masterpiece.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think that this has become sort of rare for me. It used to happen a lot because I had to buy a CD, and had to just stick with that CD. But this was like an album that when it first dropped, I listened to it. I couldn't believe what I just heard, and like just had to immediately start it again, and it was just like I listen to it often still, where I just like am constantly in awe at it. I honestly, in a weird way, kind of feel like that James Blake album is like the prototype of what Blonde is, which is this just aggressively minimalist, aggressively like fragmentary kind of stream of consciousness, from this genius.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, it's just bold. It's just completely daring to make tracks like this. And then I also found that, like, it was sort of like in my memory, I was like, well, that's really like a, it's got that White Album vibe to me, which I like, but it's like just this crazy mixed bag that just kind of changes directions all over the place. But listening to it this week, I found that it hangs together really well. The skits, they always have that same like sort of melody underneath them. You know what I mean?
Oh,
and
yeah.
It actually, it's weird when you just sort of listen to it. It can sound like a mess, but with a little distance from 2016, I feel like it really is just like this tightly, crafted masterpiece. Okay, I don't suppose that's on your list, Dan.
No, but I will say that I do appreciate that record. It's kind of not my style of music, and I think I said that when we reviewed it on Pitchfork. It's just not really my style, but I do like it. I think it's a great record, and in fact, like my wife loves it, and she'll put it on the car, and I never like mind it playing. It's just nothing I personally would ever pick to listen to.
Okay, well, what's your number 2?
Number 2 for me, Swans, To Be Kind from 2014. I talked about it, like Swans becoming this new band, and I think that this, they somehow like improve on the Seer here. We're getting like you said earlier, like this one's a little bit more accessible, and I agree with that. It's got more like sort of traditional like rock songs in it, but then we've also got Bring the Sun, Lucent Overture or whatever, which is 35 minutes long, and right. and straddles between like this rocking thing and just straight ambient drone kind of things. It's just like this strange melding of quote unquote normal music and like experimental. I think this is the greatest guitar based record that has been made in definitely the last decade, and maybe much longer than that.
What a quote.
Yeah. You can have that. Put that on the record sleeve,
That means your number 1 isn't going to be Car Seat Headrest then, I guess.
It actually, I didn't want to spoil it, but
yeah. But also, I think it's really interesting, because I talked about how hard the Seer grooves. This one also grooves in a really cool way to where it's got a little bit of an Afrobeat vibe in some of those,
which is something I love.
Very interesting.
Like strange. You wouldn't think, you don't think Fela Kuti when you think Swans.
Yeah,
but
I think it's like unfair sort of, because people talk about Swans like, oh, it's just like punishing, so heavy, but like it grooves. It really, really grooves.
Yeah, 100%. And I love, I'm huge into Afrobeat and everything. And yeah, so I mean, I definitely can see those influences there. And just, I mean, this was another one of those records. The first time I heard it, I was like, goddamn, this is amazing. I mean, I remember when the first single, Little God in My Hands, got released. I remember we were like at your old apartment, and I like made you put it on the your little portable speaker. And just even just hearing that one song, I was like, I was already excited for the record, but through the roof at that point.
All right, Darren, what is your number 2?
Number 2 for me comes from 2010, and it's Have One on Me by Joanna Newsom.
Okay.
Oh, you scared me for a second when you said 2010.
This was like constantly floating around the like 9 or 10 spot for me, and sadly fell off. I do adore it.
You were going to have it on your list, but
why did you pick it?
So when we started doing Pitchfork, when we started podcasting, right? Like one of the things I really wanted to try to do was talk about Johanna Newsom in this record, but we just, obviously just didn't happen. I really had wished we had talked about like 2010 or something.
Yeah.
And we kind of referenced the year over and over again.
We can do that next year.
Yeah, that would be perfect, actually. But this was one of the records I just wanted to talk about because I just absolutely adore the record, like all the way through. It's an enormous record, 2 hours long. I had been following Joanna Newsom since like the Milk-Eyed Mender, like way back in 2004, right? And she released a record Ease like 2 years later, and then it's like another 4 years before this epic comes out. And I mean, this is like, it's like, poetry set to music. It is like a novel set to music, just the way it's difficult even to describe the lyrics because honestly I don't even know a whole lot of like what exactly she's talking about like specifically because they're just sort of themed around different characters, different visuals and stuff. It's just, but the music itself I find so captivating. I feel like it's a really great album to listen to like late at night, early in the morning, like just so many like great settings for just putting this on and letting it go. Like you just don't, you really can't just jump in at any one point. Like you really have to kind of just start from the beginning and just let it continue on, like, and sort of just sweep you away. You know what I mean?
Yeah, really interesting how one of the few who sort of, started in that cutesy indie, era and sort of grew up before our eyes or ears and was like, just emerged in 2010 as this like a bona fide, just one of the best songwriters ever. Again, like kind of similar with the Father John Misty album for me. Like I come back to like the songs here, which are just incredible. Like the melody on, I don't know, On a Good Day or like Go Long or the last track Does Not Suffice or something. They are so moving. Baby Birch is one of my favorites. Like so moving. The production is so minimal, it feels, I think sort of in contrast with that Father John Misty album, it's like, it's not really updating the 70s singer-songwriter sound very much at all. It kind of like, if I didn't know better and you just told me it came out in 1974, I'd be like, yeah, okay, sure. But it kind of ends up not mattering to me. Like I'm not blown away by the production, but the songs, they totally make up for it, I feel. My number 2 is Autechre's NTS Sessions 1 through 4. Don't try to tell me it's 4 albums. It's 1 album.
I'll say, I was just talking to my wife right before we started recording. I wanted to put either this or LSEC, but I couldn't fucking decide. I couldn't decide if LSEC was 1 or 5 records, and then 2, I couldn't decide, is NTS like, is it an actual album or is it a live thing? Is it just radio set? I couldn't decide, and so I left it off purely because I could not decide if it was 1 album or if it was an album at all. That's 100% the only reason.
I really, really believe that this should be considered an album. LSEC should be considered an album.
All right, well then redo the podcast. I'm fixing my list.
But I just, again, this is a case of like Autechre is one of the best artists ever, one of the best bands ever, or groups, or whatever the hell. And this is almost like their crowning achievement. And I think it's, we actually have in our feed an entire episode where me and Dan talk for like 2 hours about the NTS session, so I won't go on too long. But it's just like Autechre is this. It's like they're the most trailblazing, just explorers of sound that we have. And in the 2000s, I feel like they were almost like spinning their wheels a little bit. But then what a decade they had in the 2010s, with like XI and LSEC and NTS Sessions. I feel like NTS Sessions is like kind of the crowning achievement of an entire decade of just like
really the culmination.
Yeah, restlessly searching for new sound. And these whole 8 hours, they have like a nice arc. If you listen to them all the way through, if you ever have a spare 8 hours, you have to do that.
A spare work day, it's fine.
But what's fun is like just every track is like a new, just let's see where we can go where we've never been before. I'm just completely in awe at that.
Wow.
Okay. I have a strong feeling that we all have the same number 1.
We better. If one of us doesn't have this as number 1, which means it did not make our list at all, you're fired from the podcast.
All right. So Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy from 2010. Dan, why did you put this at number one?
I mean, this is just like, this is the epitome of a classic record, you know? Like, Kanye was already big, Late Registration, College Dropout, I mean, even Graduation, but then the whole Taylor Swift thing, he goes away, comes back with just this, like, absolute masterpiece of maximalism, which is, like, maximalism, I think, in music is something that is, like, so difficult to do well and to control.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of like another like sort of maximalist record that I even like can think of or enjoy, and he just like completely does it here. And then surprisingly also makes like one of the best minimalist records just 3 years later. But but yeah, I mean, this is just like insane. Like, it's so, every song is so huge. Like, this is a record I love to like just lay in bed at night and just put on your good headphones and listen to it and just try to like hear all the if you just like really concentrate, you can hear sounds you've never heard before. There's so many things like going on. I mean there's a whole podcast just about like this album itself. What was it, Dissect or whatever?
Dissect.
I mean, this is unequivocally classic, so much so that like even Pitchfork couldn't, they gave it number 2, but regardless, right. Even with all the Trump shit, whatever, I don't want to get into that. Like, they still could not, give it the Sun Kill Moon treatment. They still had to put it on there. They had to, because people there'd be riots in the street if they left this off.
Yeah, why is this your number one, Darren?
I mean, as much as I love, Have One on Me and all the other records that I talked about on this list, like, this album is like, miles and miles and miles above the rest of this list for me. Like, it is just, there was no question.
It's the one that never changed.
It never changed. It never ever changed. It was the best album at the start of the decade. It is the best album at the end of this decade. It is everything that you said, Dan. Obviously I totally agree with. I guess I would just, maybe talk about a few like particular songs or sort of how, this is an album I just have never stopped listening to. My favorites have changed over the last decade. I still remember like exactly where I was when I watched like the Runaway performance, on the award show and everything. Like, Monster. I mean, I don't even know like where to begin. Like, we could spend, I feel like we could spend hours and hours just talking about like this record.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I almost want to. I think that was the challenge this week, is I was like, God damn, every one of these albums we could do a whole episode on, and this we could do, like a series of episodes on, honestly. But I was just like shocked, honestly. I hadn't listened to it in maybe a couple of years. I always come back to it every few years, but I just found myself this week, really thinking in terms of like, how do things hold up? How have they aged or whatever? And I was just shocked by, this has not lost a drop of, it's like breathtaking quality. Unlike Good Kid, Mad City or something, which blew my mind at the time, this doesn't sound old or anything, And I just think about what a level up this was like for all of music. It's like the embodiment of extraordinary, to where I don't think we get stuff like To Pimp a Butterfly or Drake's Take Care or let's say Beyonce's Lemonade. Like, we don't get these highly conceptual like pieces of art in mainstream hip hop, R&B without Kanye's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy.
Completely
it was
agree.
Just like, I think it was just apparent to everybody immediately, these are the heights to which we should all be aspiring, and it still sounds like that. I cannot, it might even sound cliche, but it's just like, just listen to the end of Runaway, and it's like, who does this? How do you, can you believe like Runaway is not the last song on the album?
I know.
Like, the most epic 9 minutes ever comes like right about in the middle, and it doesn't kill the momentum at all, and just the way like it just seamlessly, I found myself appreciating like the transition from the end of Devil in a New Dress into Runaway, how perfect that is. Like, the way it just sets the plate for a track like Runaway. Doesn't that feel like it would be hard to do,
Yeah, I mean, I think Runaway, you know, if I have to pick like the greatest song of the decade or something, I think Runaway is the easy choice. And yeah, it's crazy that it's not the closer of this record. And in fact, like there's that like big skit with Chris Rock talking,
right,
and like in anything else, we were sort of bitching about the skits in like Good Kid, Mad City, but like here Kanye like makes it work. He puts it in there, and I don't mind. I never skip that or anything. It's just like insane. Like you said, I think this like completely elevated popular music to the levels of like, we're making art here. We're not just just making some bullshit albums.
Yeah, and just like like again, like the way that you in the middle you sort of crescendo with Runaway, and then it crescendos again in a way that is almost just as breathtaking with like like Lost in the World is obviously amazing, but then the way that the sample from Power, like the choir voices come back for Who Will Survive in America, they're playing underneath with like the bongos and stuff. You're just like, I don't know, like your just jaws on the floor when this record ends. Okay. Anything else to say about to gush about Kanye before we move on?
No, I think we should save it for the 10th anniversary episode.
Yeah, and we might actually be doing a Kanye episode next week when we talk about Jesus is King, if it actually comes out in only 35 minutes. We'll see. Any honorable mentions? I think we sort of mentioned some of them, but that just were like right on the fringe, and you're sort of sad you couldn't get them on your list.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned most of mine. There were things you had on your list, or a few you had, Darren. Scott Walker, Son, Soused. I really kind of thought about that. Even Bish Bosh, just Scott. Those ones like sort of teetered on and off. I really like wanted to get Ice Age on there. I absolutely love Plowing in the Field of Love and Beyond lists. But just couldn't quite break it. I thought I would put Death Grips on there, but honestly, I re-listened to it, and it just didn't age as heartily as I had hoped.
Yeah, what about you, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned like The Suburbs from Arcade Fire. Congratulations, MGMT was an album that we had recently did a podcast on, and I was like sort of like very turned on into that record, but just couldn't find a place for it. Also, like Bjork's Volnicura, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, was an album I really, really liked back in the day, and I did return to it, but I just couldn't really find a place on the list for it.
Yeah, that was actually in the running for me too. I mentioned Joanna Newsom's Have One on Me. Frank Ocean's Channel Orange we sort of discussed. The Suburbs, I think, is really great, but it just really sounds like 2010. Yes. And it was really trying, I think, to capture 2010, and it did a great job, but now in 2019, maybe sounds a little odd. A weird one for me, King Cruel's The Ooze, which was like my favorite album of 2017, I think. I still really, really adore that album. I think it's very much in the mold of like Frank Ocean's Blonde or like that James Blake album, like this very minimal, bizarre, fragmentary thing that I love to get lost in. It's not one that I would imagine I would find myself returning to, but I actually have since it came out, returned to it quite a lot. So that was at one point in my list. Let's talk about...
Can I mention one more thing? So I was looking back at our 2017 end of the year list that we did a podcast on, right? And I didn't mention any albums from 2017. My number one at that time was Jay Som's Everybody Works, which I came back to and was just kind of like, meh, it was fine, but it's not that great anymore. The second one, of course, was Mount Erie's A Crow Looked at Me, and I didn't even dare listen to the record again. I was just like, I don't want to be this sad. I don't want to do.
No, I told you when we did that episode. I like that record a lot. It's a great record, but I never fucking want to hear it again in my life.
Yeah, see, I feel like Skeleton Tree sort of escapes that for me a little bit, but it's like still a little in that ballpark where I can't listen to it too much. So yeah, that it's weird how that sort of can handicap an album when you're making a list like this. And I do want to talk about our philosophies as we're making this list, which will sort of transition us, I think, into Pitchfork's list. How did you go about this? I talked about how I kind of tried to be like, let me just sit down, play these albums I used to love, and see what is still surprising me, or what's still, amazing me, or whatever, and what's not so much. And I tried really hard to avoid the trap of like, you got to put this in there. It's so important. Like, it's got to be there. You know what I mean? Did you find yourself struggling with that?
No, I sort of like, what I did is I thought of it of like, I'm not a publication, I'm making like my personal list.
Right.
And so I didn't say, because if I did do that, I think like Blonde would have to make it and stuff. So I did like, what are the records that like, even, after all these years, I still like to listen to, I still return to often. And I basically I like wrote a list of every album that I would give like an 8 or higher to for the decade. And then, I went through, I listened to a bunch. Some were like, obviously when I basically wrote 1 to 10. I wrote Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy as number 1, and then I started filling out the rest. But yeah, I sort of worked my way through it, and I did it just purely like what I personally enjoy, what is important to like the scene and music that I enjoy. Really sort of like personal, I guess.
Yeah. What about you, Darren?
Yeah, I think my approach is very similar. I was kind of obviously starting with albums that I felt a personal connection to over the last decade.
Yeah.
Sorry. I also still, I looked at, Pitchfork. I looked at Rate Your Music, and there's definitely some albums that I was like, oh yeah, I need to, check these things out again. Like, Modern Vampires of the City, honestly. Like I talked about how much I had listened to it a lot, but it recently just hadn't really listened to it. So I kind of needed to confirm that it was still what I thought it was. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there was, I think like I kind of wanted to mention like Kanye West, like The Life of Pablo was a situation where I did feel like, like I still feel like Kanye is like the most important, artist of our generation, or at least of the last decade. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I have to give special attention to not really dark fantasy. I knew where that was going to be, but Yeezus and Pablo, I felt like belonged somewhere on the list. I just needed to figure out like where,
Yeah. I think that, I guess I talked about it, but it's like, I found myself starting with this list that was like, well, you got to have that. The 2010s isn't complete without that. I think maybe the best example of this is like Kendrick's To Pimp a Butterfly, which I do really love. I think it's maybe a little overrated because it maybe a little too long, and it ends with like this long, just somebody just talking, sounding like Tupac or whatever, which is like sort of unlistenable. But I do like it a lot, but it felt like one of those things like, damn, I got to get that in here. I got to get it in here. Like what kind of list would it be without it? And I just sort of decided, you know what, fuck that. Like, yes, I'm going to put My Bloody Valentine on a list of albums, of the 2010s. I'm going to put Godspeed, because I just think it's the best. Another thing, and this is where I may get into trouble, is representation. Okay, which, as we'll discuss, I think is really important for a place like Pitchfork. But I was mortified to basically realize that I couldn't fit a single female artist on my top 10.
Big surprise.
Darren, you did a pretty good job with that, it seems. But, doesn't it feel like, it feels like it's important, right? Because when you look at like Rate Your Music's list, the first woman I think is like Joanna Newsom, and she's not until like 25 or something like that also. And yeah, that website skews really male, probably. But it feels like wrong if, when you look at your list and you don't see any women, it seems impossible that no women made like a top 10 album of the year list. And I found myself like wrestling with this idea of like, should I be like dishonest with myself and replace, Swan's the Seer with Joanna Newsom's Have One on Me, even though I like the Seer a little bit more? Like, did you wrestle with any of this at all?
I honestly didn't think about that at all. I just picked the records that I like. If I don't think about it's women, men, gay, straight, any of that. I didn't bring politics or anything. These are just records I enjoy. I didn't think any deeper than that.
Yeah, I think that's like, yeah, go on.
What I sort of thought a lot about was like, how well am I representing the decade? You know what I mean? Like, am I giving each year a fair amount of my time, a fair shake at making the list? Obviously, ideally, you would think one album from each year would make the list. Like, obviously, that's just not reality. Right. You know what I mean? And I was a little surprised that I have more 2016 records on this list than I did 2010, which I still feel like is one of the best years in music.
Yeah, 2016 was I did think about the year thing because I sort of realized that 2016 was adding up on it, and so I did try to be like, am I sort of thinking? So I went through like rate your music of like each of the years and did like sort of double check my initial like things I like list, and realized it just was a good year.
Yeah, I mean that's just what I struggled with, is all this kind of stuff. Like, am I representing every year? Am I representing like all the kinds of different voices that we heard in this decade? And I just settled with like, I'm just gonna be honest with myself, maybe to a fault, of like, this album moves me most.
I did have a thought of like, I got 3 Kanye records and and 2 Swans. I was like, should I replace one of the Swans? Just to talk about something else. But then I said, I mean, I'm being dishonest if I moved it.
Yeah. So I feel like I just really value honesty in a list. Narrative. I tried to be narrative free.
Yeah,
like,
same.
I know that this album is really important or whatever, but that doesn't automatically shoot in here. Now, for the opposite example, Darren, would you read Pitchfork's top 10 albums of the decade?
All right, coming in at number 10, we had Frank Ocean's Channel Orange from 2012. Number 9, D'Angelo and the Vanguard, Black Messiah from 2014. Number 8, Robin, Body Talk. That's an album I did actually come back to, from 2010. Number 7, Vampire Weekend, Modern Vampires of the City. Nailed it. That was in 2013. Number 6, Solange. I'm sure that was close on y'all's list too. A Seat at the Table, 2016. And god damn it, number 5, Fiona Apple. The idler wheel is wiser than the driver of the screw, and whipping cords will serve you more than ropes will ever do. Wow. From 2012. Thank you for that.
What? I didn't hear you. What was that
again? Number 4, Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly from 2015. Number 3, Beyonce's Self-Titled from 2013. Number 2, Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy from 2010. And coming in at number 1, Frank Ocean, Blonde, 2016.
So, I think that in reacting to this list as a whole, we could talk about beyond the top 10, obviously, but there is a obvious, concerted effort to try to make this representative, right? So it's like, we can't, I just think it's like dishonest. Like, they don't think that Beyonce's self-titled album is the 3rd best album of the decade, but it's like, it would be unfortunate, if they couldn't get like a woman up there in the top 3, you know what I mean? There's some of that going on. There's also stuff like Beyonce is such a huge presence that how can she not be on the list? She ended up having 3 albums in the top 50, which I've never even heard somebody say that her album 4 is a masterpiece or anything, so that blew my mind. But, there's like that kind of vibe, like, got to get Beyonce in there. She was so important to the decade, regardless of the music, we got to get like, nobody thinks Taylor Swift is good, don't at me. Like, she's not good. She's like, an important personality in the decade, undoubtedly. Mm-hmm. And so Pitchfork like puts her album, gotta forget which one it was, Red at number 59, which like, seriously, try to listen to that without fucking cringing. It's shit. Yeah. Dog shit. I swear to God. And
I mean, if they were acting this way, like when Britney Spears was like popular, you would see Britney Spears on a list like this.
You would just, because I understand the impulse, is what I was trying to say earlier. It's like, how can I represent the 2010s and not mention Taylor Swift? But don't we have to be honest and just say it's great? They're ranking her personality, like her brand, at number 59. You know what I'm saying?
Right. I think you got to make a separate list for something like that. Important figures of the 2010s in music, something like that. Like, you just can't throw an album on there just because, like, well, we got to get a Taylor Swift in here somehow.
Right. And like Rihanna comes in at number 12, her album Anti, which I think is like a cool record, but it's like a lot of pop albums where it's like, like 6 awesome songs and then like 6 songs that are just filler or whatever. And it's a perfect example of the kind of artist that did not follow Kanye's lead with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy and realized, like, I got to make a statement. You know,
I like
it's
that one anti is executive produced by Kanye, which is funny. But also, my wife was giving me her list. That's what she would put as number one. So she's gonna be very angry with you. She loves that record.
No, I think it's like surprisingly awesome. I just want to clarify, but it's like I don't think it's like a perfect record. No. It's not a perfect record by any means. In fact, I wouldn't bat an eye if it was like somewhere in the 100 to 150 range or something
I agree
like
with that. Yeah.
Because it's really, really solid. But they put it at number 12 because they wanted to put Rihanna at number 12, you know?
Right.
No, I completely agree. I mean, because when you talk about like who is the most important like figures of the 2010s, like of course I would say a Beyonce. I'm right. Kanye, Beyonce probably number one and number two. Rihanna definitely on that list. Taylor Swift definitely on that list. But I don't want to listen to fucking any Taylor Swift record, or I don't mind Rihanna that much, but I don't really want to listen to her. And Beyonce is better than all of those, but Lemonade's fine. But those records, they're not ones that I'm putting on very often or at all, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I want to take issue with Robin being at number 8. And you guys both know I'm a pretty big fan of Robin, especially when that whole Body Talk series came out. There's like a part 1, 2, and 3, and then this is like kind of combining them all, which I never liked. Actually, I was a bigger fan of like the EP style that she was releasing back in 2010. But I mean, look, they were great in 2010. Like those mini albums were really wonderful, some great songs, but they have not aged very well. Like coming back to those songs, like they're just not. It sounds very much like I'm back in 2010 again. And that's not great when you're talking about a record that belongs on a decade.
You're talking longevity at this point. You're not talking the best of 2010. You're talking...
When we talk about the year itself of 2010, right, Robin will be in the discussion probably. But how has it aged just in the last 10 years? To me, not very well. So I was very surprised to see it so high on this list.
Yeah, that raises another issue that I found myself coming back to, which is like, you got to think about like, what is this list going to look like in a few years, when like more of the dust has settled, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's like, so another thing that we definitely got to talk about, right, is that a couple artists, well, many artists were notably left off, but a couple of the most notable are like Sun Kill Moon, okay, which Pitchfork loved, Benji, Swans, no albums on the list, Ariel Pink. All three of these artists have like some issues, right, in their personal lives, I guess. Sun Kill Moon famously called a Pitchfork writer a bitch, said some misogynistic things, definitely, and Pitchfork like canceled him. Swans, there's a little bit of some Me Too allegations that I guess I don't want to get into it. They sound like flimsier than most, but that was enough for them to cancel. And I just think about, like in, I don't know, when Benji gets reissued in like its 20th anniversary reissue, right? Is anybody going to say it sounds really good, but 20 years ago he called a writer a bitch? Like we're going to eventually get over it. And it's like, let's say that somebody did do something awful, right? In like 30 years, is it really going to like matter that much? Are they going to be canceled for 50 years, 100 years from now? Will they still be canceled? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, can we just think ahead and be like, you know what? After some time has passed, we're going to realize that this was a really great work of art.
Yeah. I mean, with Sun Kill Moon, they absolutely like loved Benji. I forget, what did it get? Like a 9.5 or something? It's very high.
Yeah, really high.
Very high. And then and then there's this whole thing. The next record that came out was Universal Themes, which I actually like more than Benji. And that was that.
I do like
that.
It a lot.
That's a sort of almost made my list record even. But that record. That record was coming out or had just come out when this whole him calling the writer a bitch thing happened. And remember, they tweeted like a link to a review.
The album had obviously been reviewed, and they rewrote it.
They deleted it very quickly.
Yeah.
And then and they gave it like an awful score, like a 3. Or I mean, don't at me. It was a very low score, and it was very obvious that they had, because it was like a week later. It was very obvious that they had like redone this, like to punish him or whatever. And like, don't send me email. I'm not, he was being a dickhead and everything, but like you got to separate the art from the artist. I don't listen to Sun Kill Moon because I think the Cause is a cool guy that I want to hang out with. He seems like a dick. I don't really want to hang out with him. Like. You got to separate that, because you make yourself look like a fool when you make this list, and then you put one of the records that you gave the highest score to doesn't even make it. Same with Swans. To Be Kind got higher score than Blonde. The Seer got an equal score to Blonde, not in the top 200. So either you're saying we forgot, or you're saying we were so wrong. It
comes back to like a dishonesty sort
exactly.
of about like what makes an album good. And what you mentioned, Dan, is it became controversial in this decade. This was like the first decade where there was an actual like interrogation of the idea of separating art from an artist, and actually there was a big pushback against that. No, we shouldn't. And that's why Pitchfork, I think, feels free to rank Rihanna herself at number 12, essentially, because they love Rihanna. And Sun Kill Moon doesn't make the list, or Swans doesn't make the list, because they don't like the actual artist. It's a big question that this decade, it's almost defined this decade in a way. I mean, what do you make of that, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I have a problem with, a publication that, advertises that they are the most important voice in music.
Right. Most trusted voice in music.
Right. But they think that they are above, they're above the practice of like reviewing music to just decide like, yeah, we're just going to completely like erase artists or albums or whatever because we can because we want to, right? And I just don't. I feel like that's being incredibly like dishonest, like you were mentioning, Gabe, and I feel like it really hurts their reputation in a lot of ways, because look, you can include Sun Kill Moon or Swans on this list, and you can throw in your little jabby paragraph about their personal troubles or whatever that was going on outside the music, but I mean, this is I'm coming here because I want to read about what's been the best music in the last decade, not about how an artist called a reviewer a bitch or anything like that. Like, that's not why I come here. You can mention it, that's fine, but let's talk about the music here, right? I mean, is this Pitchfork the politics? Like, here's how to be a cultured millennial. Right. No, that's not why I'm here, right?
Yeah, I just keep coming back to like, is it gonna matter in a couple decades? Do you want your list to look like completely stupid in a couple decades? Like, is that out? Is Cause's comments, are they gonna matter in 20 years? Probably not. And on the same token, like, God, I hope your wife doesn't hate me, but like Rihanna, she's cool, right? She's really really cool. But is she gonna matter in 20 years?
Oof, careful.
Not at this rate. Like, she's got to drop like a Lemonade or something pretty soon here. But I doubt it, right? And so a lot of this, I don't know, it's just really tainted with that aspect. Other weird stuff. I think this is sort of an interesting philosophical question that you kind of brought up, Dan. 8 2019 albums made the Pitchfork list, including Big Thief at number 33, very high, and Lana Del Rey at number 19. Doesn't that feel weird? I mean, didn't you guys sort of struggle with this? Like, how the hell do I put a 2019 album on my list? It
does. And I sort of mentioned it, but like something like My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, I've had almost a decade to digest that record. Whereas like I said, I almost wrestled with putting Ghost Teen on here, Nick Cave, but I've only had 3 weeks to digest that record. Maybe in 10 years I'll fucking love that record even more. Maybe next year I'll say, that it didn't grow on me. I kind of don't ever listen to it again. So it's like sort of hard, and I think that's not Pitchfork's fault. It's not any publication's fault. Yeah. I think it's just you can't wait 5 years to put out your decade list, because then nobody's going to give a shit. And so you do sort of have to kind of pick and choose and sort of like maybe prognosticate what you'll feel. But like, I mean, Lana Del Rey at number 19. I feel like you could just go ahead and say that's not going to be correct.
That's going to be a bad call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even those Big Thief records, I listen to those because they're getting so much hype.
Yeah, I don't get it.
I don't get it. I mean, I'm not the biggest indie rock fan in the world. I know it, but I didn't get it.
I mean, I think it's difficult, obviously, to do that. I think lists like this are like fluid. I mean, I feel like in 5 years, my list might be slightly different, right?
Yeah, I agree.
But on the other hand, though, if like a dark fantasy like sort of album came out in 2019, I mean, I wouldn't hesitate to throw it at like number 10 or something like that, just because I feel like when dark fantasy came out, like you just kind of knew like this is
that's
classic,
true. But that's one of the, I mean, that's the last record for Pitchfork to get a perfect 10, like non-reissue or anything.
I mean, that was sort of a rare moment, I think.
For sure.
I found myself feeling like worried that I was going to be not, I guess I can't think of a term for it, but it's like biased toward the middle of the decade, because some stuff from 2010, 2011 is starting to sound a little old now. Stuff from like 2018, 2019, it feels too new. But stuff right in that middle part is like the stuff that I'm not bored of, but also, still sounds fresh. You know what I mean? It's like, so I found myself wrestling with that. Now, on the same note, though, there were several moments where Pitchfork seemed to sort of admit that they got it wrong on this list. So they're not above doing that, which I'm sure they will do when they make another 2010 list in a few years. But something like Run the Jewels 2, which they named Album of the Year in 2014, which I thought was really bizarre in 2014, but for some reason they were all on it. It went from number 1 in 2014 down to number 131 of the decade.
Wow.
Kendrick Lamar's Damn, they named that the number 1 album of the year, and it dropped down to number 57 overall. I think a lot of people have sort of felt like that wasn't his best effort. Be the Cowboy, you mentioned, Darren, it went from number 1 of 2018 to number 64 overall. I mean, Run the Jewels is the biggest case of this, but it's kind of like, but there were other things where, because they published like in 2015 like a best of the decade so far, and stuff like Tame Impala, if it was like number 4, it fell all the way down to like the 120s or something. So these are cases where that I just thought were sort of odd, but I guess we can't hold it against them to admit that they were wrong. I actually kind of think they were right on all these changes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you can, like, that is something I think you can commend them for, is like them not sticking to their guns on things, because Run the Jewels, I think, is a big one, and we did a whole podcast on the old one about it.
The problem, though, is that, like, I knew in 2014 that this was not the best album of the year. It was very obvious to me.
Yeah, true. But I will say, like, especially the first Run the Jewels, like, when that first came out, like, I thought that was, like, a pretty badass record. I didn't put it at the top. I liked Run the Jewels, too. Again, I wouldn't put it at number 1. But, it was good. Whereas now, like, if those records are so cringy to me, like, if I even try to listen to, like, I like hate those albums now. Whereas they
really aged strangely.
Yeah, like I used to like really enjoy them. Even Damn, I gave whatever year that came out. I'm pretty sure I put that at number 1. And it didn't make my top 10. I still like it. But it was one of those records that, like, in the moment, seemed a little bigger and better than it was, and it's still great. I mean, it would probably make my top 50 or something, but I mean, I could see that one.
Anything else jump out at you, Darren, as like really odd about this list?
Nothing in particular. I mean, I guess my biggest beef really is with what we've been talking about, and largely some of those albums that were in the number or the top 10. I mean, we didn't even talk about like Solange being there. And I remember praising that album when we were talking about, when we talked about it in 2016, but I haven't listened to it since then. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it's dear to some people. I get that impression, but I don't get that at all either. Pitchfork, in addition to publishing this list, they publish, I don't think we really need to talk about like the song list was, the song list came out the day before the album list, and it was like one of the bigger what the fuck moments I remember. Like almost everybody was just like, this is the worst list I've ever seen. They had a readers list, which was a little bit, it's like readers lists are consensus. I don't think is like the best way to evaluate albums,
Agreed.
but in addition to these lists and things, they have been publishing some articles, sort of summing up, trends of the decade as a whole, and I think this is very interesting. So one of the notable ones was called "Activism, Identity Politics, and Pop's Great Awakening." You kind of want to assign like narratives to a decade. You know what I mean? Like when we think about like the 70s, there's like we think, there was a narrative in the 70s. It sort of like started with, the takeover of, I don't know, people like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and like heavy rock and really, Pink Floyd and all that stuff like that. And then it ended with like punk sort of killing all that, but there are other narratives going on at the same time. There's stuff like disco is happening, and the singer-songwriter stuff we were talking about. So, but you try to get a sense of these narratives, and it's hard, but you try to do it in the immediate aftermath, or I guess negative 2 months from the end of the decade. And what I struggle with here is that Pitchfork is they're kind of forcing this to be a thing, and then acting like it was a thing on its own, that like pop became political and, woke, quote unquote. It feels to me like circular. It feels like, let's say that like because Pitchfork has an effect. It's still the most dominant, music publication, even though it sucks now. Imagine if like the biggest, most important art institute announced for the next, 10 years, we're only going to accept like paintings of birds, right? And then afterwards they were like writing an article like, this was a really interesting decade. All of a sudden everybody started painting stuff about birds, like interesting trend. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get what you mean. It's like, did they create, this narrative, or is it the genuine narrative of it?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. That's something I it's a sociology thing or something, whatever. Like maybe a little above my pay grade, which is 0. I get paid nothing for this.
Yeah, that's true. What do you think of that, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at, as you were like speaking on it, I was like looking at my list, my albums, and like wondering if any of these albums would even fit into any of these, right? Like, I don't really think any of my records would really, go into that. Like, I don't think there's any. I don't think we would disagree that like there has been a lot of like, I guess, awakening sort of happening, this decade in various forms of media, not necessarily just music, right? But
right.
And it's kind of a hard thing for me to like speak on, just because I feel like I've just sort of always been outside of that, and it's not like a matter of like an ageism thing where I'm like, oh, I just feel too old to really like pay attention to what is going on. I just think it's kind of it has a lot to do with like, I just don't think there's anything different, like, or anything incredibly different about this decade versus like the decade before that. Like kind of like what you were saying, like there's always like these other narratives going on and stuff, but I think that this is like the hot topic. And it seems like Pitchfork is sort of just, jumping right on the bandwagon almost to like continuing to push. I mean, they've been doing this, right? This is kind
of... that's my thing, right? It's like it requires a little distance to sort of understand like what made the decade, So like the 2000s, it took me a while to be like, because I remember as a younger kid, reading like, oh, this is what the 90s was about. This is what music in the 90s like did, and being like, oh, that makes sense to me, and then thinking about the decade I was in, the 2000s, and being like, I don't really see a trend, any trends here. Like you're too close to it, and you have to kind of forget about things that contradict and blah, blah, blah. But, and I can't blame them for trying. But it kind of feels to me like Pitchfork decided what the narrative of this decade was going to be sometime around like 2012, 2013, and then made it happen, like this is going to be the decade that indie is replaced by mainstream pop, and mainstream pop gets really deep and political and interesting. And, coincidentally, they had been purchased by Condé Nast and needed to cover more popular things that people will click on, but that's another topic. We did a whole episode on that, actually, you can listen to in our feed. But again, that dishonesty that I feel like just comes off of their list and their sort of recapping. On that note, though, let's try and fail to do the very same thing. How would you guys define the 2010s? Like, what are the narratives? What are the trends that are going to be important in this decade.
Yeah, I mean, it like you said, it's so hard to do it when you're like in the midst of it because really, I think like one of the big things is it's hard to like think back too far. Like when you think of like things, you kind of think like what happened this year and stuff. It's like sort of hard to like look at it as a whole while you're in the midst of living it. Some of the stuff that like Pitchfork talks about, I think like sort of it is like a defining thing of it. But again, a part of me also feels like that's actually sort of recent, like, within the last 4-ish years or something. Yeah, and like maybe I'm thinking that just because I'm close to it, like I don't know. It's almost like an impossible task to like. I feel like I'm only just now realizing the themes and narratives of the 2000s themselves. Like it's like nearly impossible to do in the midst of it.
What do you think, Darren?
Well, I mean, I don't think that it's not okay. So like, I think of like the Me Too movement. I feel like that is a pretty large portion of this decade, and it's not just specifically about women specifically coming out about being like harassed by so and so famous person, whatever. It's kind of become like this era of coming out and saying something about being offended or being mistreated in some way, and I feel like obviously the media in some ways, music, Pitchfork even as well, helps kind of circulate this stuff, right? And keeps it in the discussion, and then people kind of continue on with that. I think about, musically, streaming, I think is been a large shift. Even at the beginning of this decade, like I was just thinking about it, like, what if Dark Fantasy came out in the age of like when Spotify was like at its top? Like, how would that have changed the discussion around that album?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's kind of crazy to think about because, would Kanye have treated it the same? Would he have been treating it like a Pablo thing where he's just like going to update it on Spotify whenever he wants, like who knows? Like, I think that's going to be something that we'll be talking about in the next decade about how much of an impact, streaming services really have had.
I was thinking about like social media too, because it feels like a big trend here was this idea of like event albums, like get everybody talking, release stuff like Lemonade or something as a complete surprise. And everybody's talking about it, but then realizing sort of that because of social media moves so fast almost that it's like, we talked about My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy for what felt like months.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And everybody talked about Lemonade for like 3 days, and then it was on to the next thing. It's also weird because if you go on Twitter, when like something big happens, right? Like let's say Beyonce releases Lemonade and you go on Twitter and you're just looking at everybody talking about it. It's just a lot of like, it's not really talking, It's just like, this is awesome. Slay Queen. You rule.
Yeah, it's not
like,
discussion.
There's no discussion whatsoever almost. So it's like, you get people quote unquote, it was like this decade was about like get everybody talking, but nobody was actually talking, and it was like these event albums that sort of like just come and go very quickly. It's going to have, I think, really weird effects on legacies that I think it's so hard to actually evaluate now. But I mean, that's obviously going to be important. Streaming, again, adds to that sort of like transitory quality, which is like, I don't really like hold albums close to me for as long as I used to anymore. It's like I sort of devour them very quickly and then I sort of move on. And then when I was compiling this list, it was sort of fun to be like, oh yeah, like I forgot about this album, and it feels like there's going to be a lot more of that. The political situation of this decade, Black Lives Matter, you mentioned Me Too. It feels like it had a big impact, but yeah, I guess I found myself sort of settling on the idea of like, it's just too soon to actually figure it out. God bless Pitchfork for trying, but I think it's going to seem a lot different with a little distance. So, kind of wrapping up here, one thing I did kind of want to mention in regard to that transitory quality, there was this kind of fun article I sent you guys. I don't know if you got a chance to read it. It was from uprocks.com about the most memory hold albums of the decade. albums that were so hyped and then just completely forgotten. Did you guys think about this at all? And did anything kind of tickle you remembering?
Yeah, I read the article and I saw like Stephen Hayden is the writer of it. I saw him post a little bit about it on Twitter, and like sort of the thread of people posting them. And one of the big ones that hit me was Dr. Dre Compton. I remember I remember when that record came out, there was this whole thing for years and years of like detox, like when are we gonna get detox, when are we gonna get detox? And then like finally Dre came out and said like it's not happening, I made it, it just wasn't up to snuff, scrapped it, which I thought was like very commendable of him. And then we got Compton, which was sort of like the detox, and so everybody was like super stoked, and I think like in everyone's stokedness they decided it was really excellent, and then just sort of forgot about it after a couple months.
We talked about this on our 2009 episode. We talked about like, I think it's a really good record, Only Built for Cuban Links 2 by Raekwon, but it's kind of like that, I can't believe how good this is when it has no business being good,
Yeah.
To kind of like
exactly.
make
it's
you
like,
feel like it's bigger than it was.
On its own, it's sort of like, okay, or something. And the other thing with Compton, not on Spotify, which we talked about like a little bit, like with MBV and stuff. I have MBV on my phone, but I got to open another stupid app to listen to it.
Right.
So I never listen to, like I rarely listen to it. And I mean, I don't have Compton on my phone, and it's not good enough to bother getting from my Dropbox and putting it on there.
Yeah. Any memory hold surprises for you, Darren?
I think of a couple. Largely like Pitchfork darlings. Like I honestly feel like Robin is sort of like that, because like I mentioned, I liked that album back in 2010, but I sort of like forgot about it. Like it's just always been like, I like that. Another one that comes to mind is, I can never say her name right, but Sky Ferrero.
Oh yeah.
Another like Pitchfork was just hailing her as like this anti-pop queen, whatever, back in the day, and just I had totally forgotten. But another one that I came across, and you guys might find this a little weird, but I know The Weeknd was obviously a big part of the decade, but the mixtapes that started his career, like House of Balloons, totally forgot about. And I was like, in fact, I was like, this is definitely going to be on my top 10 list. I need to come back and check this out. And I did. And, it just didn't, I felt like it didn't really hold up. Maybe it's because a lot of like mainstream music has really kind of like taken the sound, and like The Weeknd
it kind of like made its mark, and then that was it.
And
no need for it.
Exactly.
I think another one, the Carters, Everything Is Love.
Yes.
Can you like?
I wanted to mention
if you're in the future and you say you're telling somebody about the 2010s, and you're like, the two biggest artists of like this decade and maybe the decade before that as well. One got married, and two made a record together. You would be like, well, that must have been fucking madness.
Yeah.
But really, everybody listened to it for one day and then promptly forgot about it.
This is the perfect example of what I'm talking about, which is like, it caused a huge, meltdown on Twitter, because it was like a complete surprise release, and everybody's talking about it, and it just vanishes. I mean, it came out in 2018.
I can't even
gone already.
Like, I know there was a song called Ape Shit, but I don't know any other song, and I couldn't like sing you a lyric.
It might be like one of the defining albums of the decade, because it's so forgettable and sums up how forgettable music is becoming. I thought of you remember like Bjork's last album, Utopia or whatever, that got so much hype, and we were all like, I don't get it, this is like a big misstep sort of. And that's vanished. I was also kind of tickled by, did you guys ever listen to Tune Yards?
A little bit.
I've heard
2010, 2011, right?
Yeah, 2011. Their album, or her album, Who Kill, was so hyped, and it was so much fun. I still think it's like kind of a fun album, but I was really fascinated to read this discussion of it and actually see more discussion on Twitter, which is like, people talked about it like it was going to be the future of music, because it was basically indie pop. And it was mixing in all these like influences, like a lot of African influences and stuff like that. And it that was like what sort of summed up the 2000s. Like in retrospect, it was more of like a capstone, on the previous decade. And then fascinating that in the next decade, it actually became like really problematic for like a white woman to make like a tropical African type album, and I just think it's I don't know, it's just something that I remember as I was looking at these albums, like, wow, the early 2010s felt really adventurous and exploratory. There was so much going on. There was like indie was great, pop was great, like everything was mixing and blah blah blah. And then in the final half of the decade, it almost feels like things settled on more of like a here's what you should do and here's what you shouldn't. I almost feel like, I don't know, with a little more time, we might feel like the second half of this decade was something of a bummer because there was less adventure. And a lot of the records I picked, I feel like were some of the most adventurous records of the decade. I talked about like Kanye's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy as like the very definition of extraordinary. And now I feel a little bit more like, Pitchfork especially, just constantly hyping like very ordinary albums. So again, I defer to my theory, which is so far, flawless, that for some reason, at the end of every decade, everything changes. So we're on to the 2020s. I feel like we're going to get a totally new musical landscape. Any predictions to wrap us up here?
I don't know. Maybe we'll get like a retro 1920s musical comeback or something. I don't know.
Swing, big band is coming back.
But that already happened in the 90s.
He's going to usher in gospel.
That's the good
one.
In fact, that's good you brought that up. As we're recording right now, it's 12:10 a.m. Kanye has said that Jesus is King will be out at midnight. That was a lie. It is not out.
Yeah, no album. Fucking clown paint on my face again.
It's not midnight like in California.
Yeah, but
don't do this, Darren. Don't do it. Everybody does this every time. Where it's like when he misses a release date, it's like, well, he lives in Wyoming, so maybe it's Wyoming. And then whatever the next, Hawaii. He recorded Fantasy in Hawaii, so maybe when it turns,
you know what record is up that's supposed to come out today? Swans, and he lives in Nebraska, which is an hour I think behind us, and there we go. It's out. It's out on time.
All right. So there's a new Swans album. There's a new Sun album. Let's.
That came out tonight.
Fuck you, Kanye. We're gonna listen to people who can release their goddamn music on time.
All right. Well, that's enough. I guess I'll spend the rest of the night staying up waiting for Kanye. So what do you think? We'd love to read your thoughts on the air. Email us popshieldpod@gmail.com. We'll have next episode 2 weeks. Maybe it'll be about Kanye. Maybe it won't. That'll depend on him. So if you like the show, help us out a lot by subscribing. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. And stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that junk. And you can message us on there too. Is @PopShieldPod. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.